Have you ever noticed that the bravest person in the room is rarely the loudest? The ballroom of the Ashford Grand Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, every polished surface reflecting wealth, influence, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Executives drifted between marble columns holding sparkling water and champagne flutes, while photographers waited near the stage where another billion-dollar partnership had just been announced. Conversations floated through the air in measured tones, each one polished, as if even ordinary words had to earn permission before being spoken. Vivian Ashford stood near the grand staircase, one hand resting almost unconsciously over the gentle curve beneath her tailored ivory dress. She carried herself with the confidence people expected from the youngest CEO ever to lead Ashford Biotech. But tonight there was a softness in her posture that only a few people noticed. She wasn't protecting her reputation. She was protecting the tiny life that had quietly become more important than every headline, every stock report, and every board meeting combined. Across the vast lobby, Nathaniel Hayes guided a janitor's cart over the marble floor with slow, deliberate movements. His faded navy uniform blended into the background so completely that most guests never looked at his face. They noticed polished floors, spotless windows, and empty trash bins, but rarely the man who made those things possible. Nathaniel preferred it that way. Quiet work left room for quiet thoughts. Every few minutes, he glanced at the old wristwatch wrapped around his left arm, calculating how long before his 10-year-old son finished basketball practice across town. His shift always ended with the same destination, the same tired pickup truck, and the same promise that no matter how exhausting the day became, his boy would never wait alone. The evening might have continued exactly as planned if the heavy glass entrance doors hadn't burst open with a sharp echo that cut through every conversation at once. A man stumbled inside wearing an expensive suit that no longer matched the anger written across his face. His words came too loudly, too carelessly, pulling every eye toward him. Music faded. Laughter disappeared. Security officers exchanged uncertain glances from opposite sides of the lobby, each waiting for the other to move first. Guests instinctively stepped backward, creating a widening circle that left Vivian standing alone at its center. The stranger pointed toward her, speaking with the reckless confidence that sometimes follows poor choices and too much alcohol. Vivian didn't answer. She simply took one careful step backward, her hand remaining over her unborn child. Fear wasn't visible on her face, but caution was. She measured every movement, unwilling to risk unnecessary stress. Cameras lowered. Conversations stopped completely. Even the clinking of silverware from the banquet hall seemed to vanish. Nathaniel looked up from his mop. For one long second, he watched everyone else watching someone else. Then he quietly leaned the mop against his cart. He removed his work gloves one finger at a time and folded them neatly on top of the cleaning bucket. Without rushing and without calling attention to himself, he walked across the polished marble floor. His footsteps were almost silent, but somehow they became the only sound anyone could hear. He stopped a respectful distance in front of Vivian, placing himself naturally between her and the growing tension. His shoulders relaxed, his voice calm enough to lower the temperature of the entire room. "Sir," he said gently, "let's make sure tonight ends better than it began." Nathaniel did not raise his voice. He did not clench his fists. He simply stood where fear had left an empty space. The man stared at him with unfocused eyes, clearly surprised that the only person willing to step forward wore a faded janitor uniform instead of an expensive suit. Around them, dozens of guests remained perfectly still, as though the polished marble beneath their shoes had suddenly turned into glass too fragile to cross. Nathaniel kept his hands open at his sides, making no sudden movements. Years of raising a curious little boy had taught him something simple. Calm traveled farther than panic. "Sir," he repeated, his tone steady enough to quiet the room. "Everyone here wants to go home safely tonight. Let us help you get there." The stranger blinked, breathing heavily as the anger that had filled the room met something it had not expected. Not resistance, not humiliation, just quiet dignity. For a brief moment, the silence seemed louder than every raised voice before it. That single pause gave the hotel security team enough time to approach carefully from both sides. They spoke respectfully, guiding the man toward the entrance without creating the public spectacle everyone had feared. Within moments, The revolving doors closed again, and the cold evening air carried the tension outside with them. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. They simply exhaled together, almost embarrassed by how quickly they had frozen when someone else had needed them most. Nathaniel reached for the mop, leaning against his cleaning cart as naturally as if nothing unusual had happened. To him, the floor still needed cleaning. The trash bins still needed emptying. Tomorrow morning the marble would reflect another crowd that would never know what almost unfolded there tonight. He picked up his folded gloves and slipped them back on one finger at a time. Behind him, Vivian finally released the breath she had been holding. Her hand remained over her stomach for another second before slowly falling to her side. She watched the janitor with quiet disbelief. Every executive she had hired to solve impossible problems had rushed toward recognition whenever cameras appeared. Yet the one man who had protected her expected no audience at all. "Excuse me," she called softly. Nathaniel stopped and turned with the same respectful expression he had worn from the beginning. "Yes, ma'am." There was no trace of pride in his face. No expectation of praise. Vivian searched for words that usually came easily during shareholder meetings and television interviews. Tonight they refused to cooperate. "Thank you," she finally managed. Nathaniel offered the smallest smile. It was warm without asking for anything in return. "You are welcome, ma'am. I am just glad you and your little one are all right." Her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Very few people had acknowledged her pregnancy that evening. Most had congratulated the future heir to a business empire. Nathaniel had spoken only about a mother and her child. Before Vivian could respond, he gave a polite nod, lifted the mop once more, and continued across the marble floor. She watched him disappear into the quiet rhythm of ordinary work, unable to explain why the room suddenly felt different, or why the simplest sentence spoken all night lingered longer than every speech delivered from the grand stage. Nathaniel Hayes clocked out 43 minutes later with the same quiet routine he had followed for nearly 4 years. He signed the maintenance log, folded his employee badge into the front pocket of his worn jacket, and carried a small insulated lunch bag that was lighter than when he had arrived, but still smelled faintly of black coffee. Outside, the cool spring air wrapped around the city as office towers reflected thousands of lights against the night sky. Luxury sedans pulled away from the hotel entrance one after another, but Nathaniel walked past them without a second glance until he reached an aging blue pickup truck parked 3 blocks away, where parking was free after 6 o'clock. The engine hesitated before coming alive, just as it always did, and he smiled softly. "Come on, old friend," he whispered. "Just one more trip." 22 minutes later, he pulled into the parking lot of Jefferson Community Recreation Center. Only a handful of lights remained on inside the gymnasium. A boy wearing an oversized basketball sweatshirt burst through the front doors carrying a backpack almost as large as he was. "Dad," Benjamin Hayes called with a grin that erased every trace of exhaustion from Nathaniel's face. The 10-year-old climbed into the passenger seat, placing a stack of homework on the dashboard before fastening his seat belt exactly the way his father had taught him years earlier. "You are 4 minutes late," Benjamin teased with exaggerated seriousness. Nathaniel laughed. "I know. I owe you one chocolate chip pancake on Saturday." Benjamin pretended to think carefully before nodding. "That seems fair." They drove home through familiar streets lined with neighborhood diners, corner laundromats, and old brick buildings that had seen better decades. It was not the wealthiest part of the city, but it was home. Their apartment occupied the second floor above a family-owned hardware store where the owner always left birdseed on the windowsill because Benjamin liked watching cardinals during breakfast. Inside, everything was modest but spotless. Shoes rested neatly beside the front door. A calendar covered with school events hung beside the refrigerator. Children's drawings framed with simple wooden borders decorated the hallway instead of expensive artwork. Nathaniel believed a home should remind people who live there, not who they wanted to impress. Benjamin dropped his backpack onto the kitchen chair and immediately noticed the untouched sandwich inside his father's lunch bag. "You skipped lunch again." Nathaniel shrugged with practiced innocence. Work was busy. Benjamin crossed his arms, looking far older than 10. "Dad," Nathaniel smiled, knowing he had been caught. "Tomorrow I will eat the whole thing." The boy accepted the answer only after watching his father take a bite right there in the kitchen. Later, while Benjamin finished a science project about the solar system, Nathaniel quietly washed dishes beneath the warm glow of a single overhead light. The television remained off. Peace did not need background noise. Did anything interesting happen at work? Benjamin asked without looking up from his notebook. Nathaniel paused for only a heartbeat before continuing to rinse a coffee mug. Someone needed a little kindness today, he answered gently. I hope they found it. Benjamin smiled to himself and returned to drawing Saturn's rings. Across town, inside a penthouse overlooking the city skyline, Vivian Ashford stood beside her bedroom window holding a cup of tea that had long since grown cold. Every few minutes her thoughts drifted back to a janitor whose name she had only learned because it was stitched in small blue letters above his pocket. For the first time in many years, she found herself wondering not about a company's balance sheet or tomorrow's meetings, but about the quiet man who had walked back to his mop as though goodness required no audience at all. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight spilling across the glass walls of Ashford Biotech headquarters, but Vivian Ashford noticed none of it. 3 meetings, 12 emails marked urgent, and 2 calls from investors waited on her schedule, yet her thoughts kept drifting somewhere far below the executive floor. Before stepping into the first board meeting, she paused beside the security office instead. Could you pull the lobby footage from last night? She asked quietly. The technician looked surprised but nodded without hesitation. Within minutes the video appeared on a large monitor. Vivian watched every second without speaking. The guests stepping away. The widening circle of silence. The janitor setting down his mop with almost ceremonial care. She replayed the recording again, then once more. It was only on the third viewing that she noticed something she had missed the night before. Nathaniel had never stepped directly in front of her. Instead, he had positioned himself slightly to the side, creating a quiet barrier that protected the space where her unborn child was. It was such a small detail that almost no one else would have seen it. Yet once she noticed it, she could not unsee it. Can you zoom in? She asked softly. The technician adjusted the image. Vivian studied Nathaniel's expression. There was no anger, no fear, no desire to impress anyone watching. His eyes carried only concern, the kind that came from instinct rather than calculation. She thanked the technician and walked away more unsettled than before. By late morning, while executives debated quarterly projections inside the conference room, Vivian barely heard a word. Profit margins blurred together. Market forecasts sounded distant. Every graph on the presentation screen felt strangely insignificant beside one simple question that refused to leave her mind. Why had a stranger cared so deeply about someone he did not know? As soon as the meeting ended, she turned to her executive assistant, Emily Foster. Would you ask Mr. Nathaniel Hayes from Facilities if he could stop by my office this afternoon? Tell him he is not in any trouble. I simply wish to speak with him. Emily blinked twice. The janitor from the hotel event. Vivian nodded. Yes. Less than an hour later, Nathaniel stood outside the executive suite wearing the same neatly pressed maintenance uniform, holding his cap respectfully in both hands. He admired neither the skyline nor the expensive artwork decorating the hallway. He simply waited until Emily opened the office door with a warm smile. Ms. Ashford will see you now. Nathaniel stepped inside with measured footsteps. Vivian rose from behind her desk instead of remaining seated. It was a gesture so unusual that Emily quietly closed the door behind them without saying a word. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The office overlooked nearly the entire city, yet the silence inside felt strangely peaceful rather than awkward. Finally, Vivian smiled gently. Thank you for coming, Mr. Hayes. Nathaniel nodded. Of course, ma'am. She studied him carefully before asking the question that had followed her since the previous evening. I have been trying to understand something. Last night, there were security officers, executives, and dozens of influential people in that lobby. Yet you were the one who stepped forward. What? Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment, not searching for an impressive answer, but simply choosing honest words. When he finally looked back at her, his voice remained as calm as it had been the night before. Because sometimes a child is depending on a decision that has not even been made yet. The words settled into the room with unexpected weight. Vivian did not answer immediately. She had expected courage to sound dramatic, perhaps even defiant. Instead, it sounded quiet, almost ordinary, as though Nathaniel believed anyone would have done the same. She slowly walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city below. Thousands of people hurried through crosswalks, carrying coffee cups, briefcases, and worries invisible to everyone else. You did not know who I was, she said softly, still facing the glass. Nathaniel smiled faintly. No, ma'am. Then why risk your job? She asked. Because I knew who you were in that moment, he replied. Vivian turned to face him, puzzled. Nathaniel continued in the same calm voice. You were a mother protecting her child. Everything else could wait. Silence filled the office again. It was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that asks people to examine themselves before speaking again. Vivian lowered her eyes toward the small framed ultrasound picture resting almost unnoticed beside her laptop. She had kept it there for weeks, yet somehow it felt different after hearing those words. Most visitors admired the awards displayed across her shelves. Nathaniel had noticed the one picture that mattered most. Do you have children? She asked quietly, although she already suspected the answer. Nathaniel reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a photograph that had been creased from years of carrying it everywhere. A smiling boy stood beside an old fishing pier holding up a tiny bluegill with unmistakable pride. My son Benjamin, Nathaniel said. He is 10 years old now. Vivian accepted the photograph carefully, smiling despite herself. He looks happy. He teaches me how to be, Nathaniel answered with a gentle laugh. Children have a way of reminding us what adults forget. Vivian studied the picture for another moment before returning it. And what do adults forget? Nathaniel slipped the photograph safely back into his pocket before answering. That people are worth more than positions. My son does not ask whether someone owns a company or cleans one. He only notices whether they are kind. The sentence landed more deeply than Nathaniel realized. Vivian thought about boardrooms where titles determined whose opinions mattered. She remembered charity galas where people introduced themselves by listing accomplishments before sharing their names. Somewhere along the way, success had become louder than character. Yet the man standing before her possessed neither wealth nor influence. And somehow he carried more peace than many executives she had known for decades. She walked back to her desk and rested one hand lightly over the ultrasound photograph. Last night, everyone kept thanking me for building this company, she said. But no one asked whether I was frightened. Nathaniel's expression softened. Strong people are often surrounded by admiration and still feel alone. Vivian looked up, surprised that he had understood something she rarely admitted even to herself. Before she could respond, a soft knock interrupted the conversation. Emily stepped inside carrying a folder. I am sorry to interrupt, Ms. Ashford, but the board meeting begins in 5 minutes. Vivian nodded without taking her eyes off Nathaniel. Thank you, Emily. As the door closed again, she realized she was not ready for the conversation to end. Mr. Hayes, she said, I invited you here because I wanted to understand one decision you made yesterday. Instead, I think I have started questioning many of my own. Nathaniel simply inclined his head with quiet humility. Sometimes, ma'am, the smallest moments are the ones that quietly change everything. The conversation stayed with Vivian long after Nathaniel quietly returned to his maintenance shift. She attended the afternoon board meeting, listened to presentations, approved budgets, and answered difficult questions. But every so often she caught herself staring at the empty chair across the conference table instead of the financial reports spread before her. Numbers had always been predictable. People were not. That evening, as the last executives filtered out of the building, Emily entered Vivian's office carrying a slim folder. You asked Human Resources for Mr. Hayes's employment file, she said gently. Vivian accepted it with a quiet thank you and waited until the office had fallen completely silent before opening it. The file was surprisingly thin. For years with the facilities department. Excellent attendance. No disciplinary reports. Outstanding performance reviews. No requests for promotion. No complaints. No recognition awards. It was as though Nathaniel had spent years doing exceptional work while carefully avoiding attention. Vivian frowned. There has to be more than this, she whispered. Curiosity led her downstairs instead of home. She found the facilities supervisor, Harold Bennett, organizing supply orders in a small office tucked behind the loading dock. When she asked about Nathaniel, the older man smiled before answering. You finally noticed him. Vivian looked up. What do you mean? Harold leaned back in his chair. Around here, people know Mr. Hayes without really knowing him. If someone misses the early bus, he quietly gives them a ride. If a new employee forgets lunch, Somehow there is always an extra sandwich in the break room refrigerator. During Christmas, toys appear for employees who are struggling, but nobody ever finds out who bought them. Vivian listened without interrupting. Harold continued. He never signs his name to anything. Last winter, one of our custodians had emergency surgery. Nathaniel traded shifts for almost 3 weeks so the man's family could stay together. He told everyone it was because he preferred the extra hours. We all knew better. Vivian slowly closed the folder. None of those moments appeared in official records. Kindness rarely did. Why has nobody ever recommended him for recognition? She asked. Harold chuckled softly. Twice we tried. Twice he politely declined. He said appreciation should never become the reason someone chooses to help. The words lingered long after Vivian thanked him and walked away. On her way toward the parking garage, she passed the employee cafeteria. Through the glass, she noticed Nathaniel sitting alone with a simple dinner packed in reusable containers. Before he even opened them, another janitor rushed inside looking worried. Nathaniel immediately slid half of his meal across the table without hesitation. The younger man protested for a moment before accepting with visible gratitude. Nathaniel smiled as though sharing dinner was the most ordinary thing in the world. He did not realize anyone was watching. Vivian remained hidden behind the hallway window for several quiet seconds. She had spent years studying leadership through books, seminars, and business schools. Yet the strongest lesson she had witnessed all day came from a man who never imagined anyone was paying attention. As she turned toward the elevator, one thought settled gently into her heart. Character was what people practiced when applause was impossible. The following morning, the building felt different, although nobody could explain why. Employees greeted one another with the same routines. Elevators climbed the same 50 floors, and coffee machines hummed in familiar corners. Yet quiet conversations lingered wherever people gathered. Someone had uploaded a short cell phone video from the charity event. It did not show the beginning of the disturbance or the expensive guests stepping backward. It showed only a maintenance worker calmly placing himself between uncertainty and a frightened mother before speaking with remarkable patience. Within hours, the clip had spread beyond the company. Some viewers praised the unknown janitor for his composure. Others questioned why a facilities employee had been allowed to become involved in such a public situation. By noon, news websites had begun sharing cropped images without context, inviting strangers to debate events they had never witnessed. Inside Ashford Biotech, members of the executive board reacted exactly as Vivian feared they would. During an emergency meeting, several directors argued that public attention of any kind could damage investor confidence. One insisted the company should release a carefully worded statement distancing itself from the incident. Another suggested that Nathaniel should quietly be transferred to another location before reporters started asking questions. Vivian listened without interrupting. She folded her hands on the conference table, allowing every opinion to fill the room before offering her own. Did anyone here watch the complete security recording? She asked calmly. Silence answered her question. A few directors exchanged uncertain glances. One admitted that he had only seen the circulating clip online. Vivian nodded slowly. Then we are discussing headlines instead of facts. She pressed a small remote, and the conference room screen displayed the unedited security footage from beginning to end. No dramatic music. No edited captions. Only ordinary people making ordinary choices under unexpected pressure. The directors watched guests step away. They watched Nathaniel quietly remove his gloves, place them on the cleaning cart, and walk forward without urgency or anger. They watched him speak with patience while protecting calm instead of creating more fear. When the recording ended, nobody reached for their notes. The room remained unusually still. Finally, one older board member cleared his throat. He never tried to become the hero, he admitted. Vivian answered softly, exactly. Across the building, Nathaniel knew nothing about the meeting taking place upstairs. He spent the afternoon replacing burned-out light fixtures in an employee hallway, greeting everyone with the same warm smile he had offered for years. When a marketing intern struggled to carry several heavy storage boxes, Nathaniel quietly set down his toolbox and helped without waiting to be asked. 10 minutes later, he was back on the ladder changing another light bulb as though nothing important had interrupted his day. Recognition had never appeared on his list of responsibilities. Near sunset, Vivian stood alone outside the conference room after the meeting had ended. She looked through the wide lobby windows where Nathaniel's reflection moved slowly across the polished marble floor, almost disappearing among the evening shadows. She realized something the board had not yet understood. Companies protected their reputations with policies, lawyers, and public statements. But trust was built by people whose names rarely appeared in annual reports. And sometimes the strongest foundation beneath a great company was not found in the executive offices above, but in the quiet footsteps of someone carrying a mop below. The board's decision spread quietly through the building the next morning. There would be no transfer, no disciplinary action, and no carefully crafted statement distancing the company from one of its own employees. Instead, Vivian requested something far less common. She asked every department manager to spend 1 hour each month working alongside a team they rarely noticed. The announcement confused some executives and amused others, but no one challenged it after the previous day's meeting. Vivian did not explain her reasoning. She believed some lessons lost their meaning the moment they became speeches. Late that afternoon, she walked through the lobby without an assistant, without security, and without the hurried pace that usually followed her from one meeting to another. Employees glanced up in surprise as the chief executive officer stopped beside a maintenance cart where Nathaniel was carefully replacing fresh flowers near the reception desk. He looked up and smiled politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Vivian returned the smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Guests continued checking into the hotel. Phones rang behind the front desk. Somewhere nearby, an elevator chimed. Ordinary life moved forward without realizing something important was unfolding inside its quiet rhythm. Vivian noticed one of Nathaniel's work boots had come untied while he carried a bucket across the polished floor. Without thinking about titles or appearances, she reached down, lifted the wooden handle of his mop just enough to keep it from sliding, and held it steady while he knelt to tie the loose lace. Nathaniel looked up with genuine surprise. "Thank you, ma'am," he said softly. Vivian answered with the smallest smile. "You are welcome." It lasted only a few seconds. Most people walking through the lobby never noticed. But an elderly receptionist standing nearby quietly wiped at the corner of her eye. She had worked in corporate offices for almost 30 years and could not remember ever seeing an executive help someone in such a simple, human way. Nathaniel stood again, adjusting the cleaning cart before continuing his work. Neither of them mentioned the gesture. Neither seemed interested in turning kindness into a performance. As Vivian prepared to leave, she paused beside him one last time. "Benjamin has basketball practice tonight, does he not?" Nathaniel blinked, surprised she remembered his son's name. "Yes, ma'am. Every Thursday." Vivian reached into her briefcase and removed a small white envelope. "Please give this to him after practice." Nathaniel accepted it carefully. "May I ask what it is?" Vivian shook her head with a gentle smile. "It is not money. It is simply something I believe a young scientist might enjoy." Later that evening, after pancakes for dinner had become a Thursday tradition in the Hayes apartment, Benjamin opened the envelope at the kitchen table. Inside were 2 admission passes to the city's Science Museum, along with a handwritten note in neat blue ink. It read, "Never stop asking questions. The world becomes better every time a curious child grows into a kind adult. With warm wishes, Vivian Ashford." Benjamin looked up with wide eyes. "Dad, she remembered me." Nathaniel smiled quietly into his black coffee before looking toward the window where the city lights shimmered against the darkening sky. "The best people usually remember what matters most," he said. And for the first time in many years, somewhere across that same skyline, 2 very different lives had begun changing each other without either of them asking for anything in return. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. But neither Nathaniel Hayes nor Vivian Ashford returned to being exactly who they had been before that evening in the hotel lobby. Some changes arrived loudly through headlines and meetings. Others arrived almost silently, woven into ordinary days where nobody thought history was being written. Every Thursday after basketball practice, Nathaniel and Benjamin visited the Science Museum using the passes Vivian had given them. Benjamin returned each time carrying another notebook filled with sketches of rockets, planets, and inventions he hoped to build one day. Nathaniel would listen with complete attention, asking questions instead of giving answers, because he believed encouragement was one of the greatest gifts a parent could offer. Across the city, Vivian found herself making unexpected changes inside her company. Executive lunches became shared meals where maintenance workers, receptionists, engineers, and senior managers sat at the same tables. Employee recognition shifted away from sales numbers alone and began celebrating quiet acts of service that rarely appeared in reports. At first, some people called the changes symbolic. Months later, they noticed something impossible to measure on a spreadsheet. People smiled more. Departments cooperated more easily. Turnover quietly declined. Respect had become part of the culture instead of a slogan printed on lobby walls. One autumn afternoon, Vivian visited a local elementary school to announce a scholarship program encouraging children from hardworking families to pursue careers in science and engineering. As she finished her speech, she noticed two familiar faces sitting near the back of the auditorium. Nathaniel and Benjamin had come simply because Benjamin loved science fairs. They had no reserved seats, no special invitations, and no expectation of being recognized. Vivian stepped away from the podium after the applause faded and walked directly toward them. Benjamin stood politely as she approached. "Ms. Ashford," he said with an excited smile, "I built a solar-powered water filter for my class." Vivian laughed warmly. "I was hoping you would keep asking questions." Benjamin carefully opened his backpack and showed her photographs of the project. Nathaniel watched quietly, his eyes filled with the kind of pride that never needed words. Before leaving, Vivian knelt just enough to meet Benjamin at eye level. "Promise me something," she said gently. "When you grow up, never believe that success is measured only by what you own." Benjamin nodded without hesitation. "My dad already taught me that." Vivian looked up at Nathaniel, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They no longer needed long conversations to understand each other. Some truths had already found their place between them. As the afternoon sun stretched across the school playground, families slowly walked toward their cars while children laughed in the distance. Nathaniel rested one hand on Benjamin's shoulder and looked toward the bright autumn sky. He had never become wealthy. He had never asked for recognition. He had simply chosen kindness when fear asked everyone else to remain still. Vivian watched them disappear into the crowd before quietly placing one hand over the life growing within her. She smiled, knowing that one day her child would ask why she had changed the way she led people. When that day came, she would not begin with boardrooms, business strategies, or billion-dollar decisions. She would begin with the story of a quiet janitor who never raised his voice, never asked for applause, and reminded her that the strongest people do not change the world by standing above others. They change it by standing beside them when it matters most.